What's up, everyone? Ben here, and today we are going to be going through Chris Bumstead's full back workout. I'm going to be going through every single exercise that he does, breaking down each of the movements from an anatomy slash biomechanics, exercise mechanics standpoint, sort of what he's doing with all of the different motions that he is using, and how you may apply them similarly, or maybe how you would want to adapt them potentially a little bit better to make them work for you if you are someone who struggles to maybe do similar movements. So let's jump right into it. We are going to start out with his first movement, which is a traditional lat pull down, right? So this is something that Chris does allegedly to, as he says, warm up his back, which seems logical to me. I tend to be someone who doesn't really spend too much time warming up, from the perspective of a lot of times my first movements are the warm-ups that I do. That's how I program for all my clients, Gen Pop and bodybuilders alike. I think it's super valuable to include other movements, though, if you are someone who maybe sits a lot during the day, maybe you have a long desk job, you need to just get in the rhythm of things a little bit, taking a little bit more time rather before you actually start your workout, working the same muscle group. So not a bad idea. Not something I would recommend for everyone who doesn't necessarily need it, but let's jump right in. Yeah, so like I said, I mean, this is a traditional lat pull down, right? And something that I think Chris does really, really well when he's executing these is, and I'll just mute the audio here, but you can see that Chris, like as he's kind of going through that more lengthened portion of the overhead position, and as he kind of comes backward toward that fully contracted position, is he's actually acquiring a little bit more of the total range. A lot of people that you'll see will tell their clients and then themselves will sit back in this sort of static position, which isn't necessarily a bad thing on its own, but they'll sit back in the static position kind of in this portion of the range, right, where they'll keep their torso sort of back like this, and then they'll just move their shoulders and their elbows on top of it. Not necessarily a bad thing, but you actually will get a little bit more range out of the tissues that surround the scaps, the shoulder blades, as well as the tissues that surround the shoulders themselves. So for instance, Chris is doing it in a way where he's actually able to load more of that stretched position to get his arms up a little bit farther overhead than he would if you were just straight back and forth, right? So there's only so much stretch that you can get specifically through the muscles that kind of sit between the shoulder blades of the spine, as well as the muscles like the lats and some portions of the rear delts, where if you are overhead, you will stretch a little bit more of a specific division of your rear delt, but whether or not that will make a difference for you, not really sure. So yeah, I think it's really also important to remember that that lean backward is not something that's done with a ton of momentum-based intent from the hips and from the spine. More so that it's this sort of controlled lean back during the pull that actually challenges more of the total range of motion than, again, if you were to just sit static, or if you were to use too much momentum-based intent for other sort of cheating type reasons.
Rows, really trying to focus on building out like kind of lower lat right now to bring that like density out of my back. So that pops on stage when I'm hitting it back double by. So do that after this, but first 2 more sets here, and that's it.
All right, so something Chris also talks about is just switching up his grip. So with any sort of pronated position, i.e. the palms are kind of turned as far this way as possible, which in a wide grip pull down isn't technically full, but partial. You have, I'll go back here, you have two different positions here. One where, in the previous section, he was using that more hand or palm forward orientation, and here where he's actually turning his palms towards face is traditionally called like a chin up grip. A lot of times what ends up happening with the chin grip is not necessarily the changes that come from it don't come directly from the grip changing the muscular recruitment at the shoulder, but rather the grip actually influencing where the shoulder moves. So typically speaking, when you turn your palm inward like this, it's not just that your forearm rotates, it's that naturally your whole arm will move a little bit closer to your body. And if your arm moves a little bit closer to your body, tighter to the rib cage, you'll get actually a little bit more lat stimulus out of that particular movement. So if you're looking for a more vertical lat focused movement, this would be a really, really solid option for many of you. If you're looking for more of an upper back focused pull down, you're going to want to opt for that variation that's a little bit wider, and also that variation that's a little bit more tilted toward moving the shoulder blades as opposed to just allowing the arms to move. But both of these are a really solid choice regardless, especially if you're a beginner or intermediate lifter. Both would be plenty of stimulus for you. And the only other thing that I would recommend, specifically for a lot of you who may struggle with fixed grip positions, is just looping free handles around a bar. It can do wonders for people's shoulders just because there is a subtle amount of forearm rotation that needs to occur with the elbows sort of fully straightening and fully bending and those kinds of things. So just thought I would make that caveat. So Chris kind of moves on to some barbell rows here.
Heavy row movement. Reverse grip rows. I used to only do overhand grip rows, and I kind of have big rear delt area like that, but my back, lower lat thickness is always lacking a bit. So I'm trying to really lean forward and pull through that like Christmas tree, so that when you hit a back pose and I like kind of Christmas tree first and then pull up, it shows that density back there. This is something Hani told me to do right at the beginning. We started working together in like August. He switched my rows over to this, and it honestly feels really good, and I feel it in a different part of my back I don't normally feel, even with like machines and everything. So started at like 2 plates, went to 275, and then I got up to 3 plates at peak strength. So as long as I've not gotten weaker yet from cardio and dieting and everything, it's like 5 weeks out, so I'm getting a little weaker. I'm gonna try 3 plates, see if I still got it, and try and get that back huge, because why the fuck not?
Yeah, so this is something that Chris kind of tilts toward for developing like mainly lower erectors. And something that he briefly just sort of touched on there is this idea of the Christmas tree, and specifically the fact that during these kinds of barbell rows, you can feel more of that sort of lower back, lower lat area contracting as opposed to, you know, more upper back rear delts preferentially. The thing that I would say about this is that if you want to develop the lowermost portions of your lats, those fibers that run a little bit more vertically up to down, right, that attach to the hip bone, you want to pick movements that are more vertical. Right, so just to simplify in terms of back training and specifically lat training, if you're wanting to train the fibers that run more horizontally, do a movement like a horizontal row that follows the direction of those fibers. But if you want to do something that's a little bit more vertical fiber oriented, i.e. those lower fibers, do something that's more up to down oriented or vertically oriented and arm path, much like the variation that Chris kind of started out with that underhand or supinated grip on that lat pull down. This will be a great exercise for total back recruitment. So if you're looking for an exercise that's going to train erectors, an exercise that's going to train lats, going to train rear delts, all the elbow flexors, the muscles that bend the elbow to some degree, this is sort of an all-in-one exercise. I typically don't tend to program barbell rows specifically for the reason that oftentimes when you get to a certain point of strength in your rowing tissues or your erectors, the load tends to not be appropriate for one or the other. So a lot of the times it's like, you know, just because of load direction and position of your body relative to that, there ends up being this disconnect between an excessive amount of erector fatigue. If that's your goal, that's great. But if not, I would suggest a chest supported row, which Chris is obviously moving on to now. So let's take a look at what he has to say.
Another bench over row, but I'm doing chest supported this time. Give my lower back a little bit of a break and make sure I'm really isolating my upper back this time. So instead of elbows in tight, underhand grip, pulling down low, overhand grip, chest supported, pulling a little higher to my chest to hit my kind of upper trap mid back.
Yeah, so another thing that I'll comment, and that was a solid explanation there, is the sort of what I was mentioning earlier about upper back, rear delt traps versus more lat focused movement is, again, that whole lat will be targeted more on the whole, even in the barbell row variation, than something like this where he's a little bit wider, moving away from the ribs. But even so, what I would say is, again, if you were looking to train that lower portion of the lat, you will get some amount of stimulus just rowing tight to your rib cage, because at some point they will contribute when your arm is in front of your body. But if you really, really want to focus on those guys, again, you want that more vertical load as opposed to something that's more horizontal. The horizontal load will be great for loading, again, those horizontal or upper lat fibers, which a lot of people tend to have naturally just because all the other sort of upper back rows overlap a lot with them.
Still heavy, but I'm just kidding.
Also, something I love about the chest supported row in particular, it doesn't matter if it's T-bar or, you know, is a little bit more of a, you know, a different variation like the prime chest supported row, any of those, the extreme row. You know, these kinds of rows are great because they don't create a limiter in the spine, much like a barbell row would. If your goal is just to train back, whether upper back or lats, I would highly recommend using a chest support for all your rowing-based motions, or at least use cables in a setup, just because it'll be a lot easier to kind of finagle a more stable orientation of your whole body. All right, so kind of moving on to a little bit more of a horizontal lat row, it looks like here, where his arm's a little bit tighter to his body. There is a little bit more of that up to down path of motion, as you can see, because of the arc of the machine. And so a really, really good option here for training those potentially middle fibers of the lat. Most predominantly, right? So those are technically speaking the ones that originate from the lumbar spine, right? The lower portion of the spine. But all of those kinds of, you know, more slightly high to slightly low movements will train that area, as well as the other two a good bit as well.
So I can like get my hip out of the way and pull my elbow in low and tight. Again, kind of hitting that full lat, lower lat. Very similar to if you're doing like a dumbbell row. But on the machine, you can kind of throw a little more weight on it, hug it a little bit more, protect your kind of core.
Yeah, so just a sort of a commentary on a little bit of what Chris just talked about there is, again, his intent is to kind of pull and squeeze his arm down to his pocket, which is fine for most people from the perspective of just a physical cue. But again, if you're going to be pulling something down, especially toward the end of the motion where you're pulling down, you want a load that is directly opposing that downward motion, right? That makes the most amount of sense for loading that path, as opposed to a motion that's more horizontal, like a dumbbell row, for instance. So instead of doing that with the dumbbell row, I would do it with something like this, that Chris is doing here. Because as you can see, that sort of lower portion of the range is where that arc starts to dip downward, right? So he is being loaded upward here. But I wouldn't do it with something, again, like a dumbbell row or a strict horizontal row. Any sort of motion that sort of arcs downward as you pull, again, we'll target more of that lower lat. All right, so next exercise is gonna be this really, really solid, I believe this is hammer strength row. And it's kind of a little bit of a low to high row that's gonna just be a total back blaster. Right, so obviously it's kind of difficult to tell what's working when everything is working and when you look like Chris. So because the angle is a little bit low to high and because his arm path is constrained a little bit more narrow to the body, he'll have a ton of horizontal lat involved with this. He'll have a ton of rear delt and a ton of trap / rhomboid. Pretty much all those guys, a big back blaster. I would also make another commentary on this movement that you can kind of see that this is almost in some ways a little bit opposite of the previous row that he just did, where when that row was slightly high to slightly low because of that arc, this arc actually works in the opposing direction, right? So as opposed to as high to low, this is a little bit of a low to high. It's almost like he's kind of scooping upward and inward. So that when he does do the row, he kind of moves up into that fully retracted, elevated position of his shoulder blades. So for those of you who don't know, when the shoulder blades get pulled back as far as possible, they also get pulled up just because of the orientation, the muscles that do that. So they'll kind of get pulled up and back toward the back of the neck. And so that's a really, really good way to train all those fibers, like within the traps and the rhomboids, between the shoulder blades, that train that fully retracted position. All right, and then so kind of moving on here, this is a little bit of a wider row, still slightly diverging, which is going to basically be another sort of rear delt variation, I would say most specifically, just because, again, he's not getting to that fully retracted position, but he does have his arms pretty wide. So rear delt is going to be really, really good, big player in this sort of wider position where you end up sort of in line with the plane of your body. Right, they'll be limited the more that the shoulder blades move, specifically the rear delt. The less that the shoulder blades move in total, the more the rear delt will be involved. Again, if the arms are a little bit wider. And you can kind of see that in his intent, I think, to really, really get a good full contraction in that rear delt. I also really like what Chris does with these kinds of reps where there's a long pause toward the fully short position. I think that's a really good idea for rows, especially. And then the other thing I would say is there's a little bit of an intent here to actually round the spine over the pad a little bit and then extend it or straighten it as he rows. And that's another sort of, we'll say, hack you can use just to get a little bit more length in the back tissues, because those scaps can fully move around the spine when it's a little bit flexed or bent, which isn't inherently bad, by the way. So he can get a little bit more length out of a row when there's a little bit of spinal motion. I don't think it's particularly necessary to do, but it is a slight advantage that you can use if it feels a little bit better for you. If you feel like your scaps can move a little bit better that way, I would suggest it. Just make sure that your chest stays relatively glued to the pad.
Two different push to get like a deeper stretch, kind of working my mobility honestly, and really hit a load on the stretch position of my lats with some overhead like that. And then when I do 2 sets of this, I don't go super crazy heavy on this because I feel like I'm gonna rip my shoulders out, and I'm doing it more for the stretch and the squeeze. And then I finish with cable pullovers, so same kind of concept, but instead of all the tension being at the stretch, it's more on the contraction down here due to the pulley pulling you forward and up instead of down with the dumbbell. So it's kind of a good thing to do these back and forth, hit both ends of the muscle, and a good way to finish off back there.
So that's really well said. Both of these movements basically have opposing resistance profiles, especially depending on the way that you set them up. You can, however, set a pulley or a cable pull over in a way that will overload that full stretch as long as you kind of just sit down into it enough. But the dumbbell kind of does that automatically. The reason I'm not a huge fan of the dumbbell, and Chris actually kind of made mention to it, is because he feels like his shoulders are going to rip out. And I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a good thing in a lot of cases, just because of the fact that too much sensation in exercise, aside from the actual tissue being trained and fatigued, is probably not the best thing, which is kind of a topic for another time. But yeah, the pullovers will be heaviest with the dumbbell and the fully lengthened, like Chris said. These will probably primarily be a Terry's major sort of lat blend, I would say, just because of how overhead he's getting. Remember, if we're talking about lat anatomy, we're talking about a muscle that doesn't stretch really beyond 120-ish degrees of elevation or shoulder flexion. And as you can see, Chris is getting pretty high above the head, and he's staying also pretty wide away from the ribs. So going to be a lot of Terry's recruitment here, going to be some lower lat recruitment as well toward the bottom end of the range, especially where he's getting that full squeeze because of that more vertical loading, as I was mentioning earlier.
Focusing a lot more when I do these pullovers on the cable, of pushing like out and down, like you're doing like a little row on like a paddle like that, instead of just pulling in. And if you're pushing the whole time down on your lats.
Yeah, so the way that he executes these is fairly biased toward Terry's, like I mentioned, which for those of you who don't know is this little muscle that kind of attaches to the shoulder blade and through underneath of the arm. But this will be a good amount of lat, especially if your intent is to kind of squeeze it. Over pullover, I'm not generally a huge fan of pullover variations for training lats. For one, just because they don't tend to stretch there the most, and number two, because other muscles tend to predominate in those kinds of ranges, especially with those kinds of wider arm internally rotated positions. So I would recommend traditional pull downs and movements where your arm is actually coming across and above your body, as opposed to just sort of out here somewhere in space. So that's it. That's pretty much it for Chris's back workout. If any of you enjoyed this, if you want to see more of these or have recommendations of whose other workouts you would want me to break down, please leave a comment, leave a like, share it or something like that, and I'll definitely do more of these because this was pretty enjoyable. So any questions about this workout or about anything else related to it, drop them below, and I'll see you guys in the next one.